many athletes I see are doing their recovery runs too fast, that they target the LT1 for everything below LT1 for their recovery. But for a, let's say, 249 marathoner or 245 marathoner, that um, their LT1 might be somewhere around, like 430, 440 might feel easy, but mechanically and metabolically, it's not what is happening. So it doesn't allow for full, let's say, lactate clearance.
Are you running a marathon? Oh, I could never run a marathon.
Sure about that? A marathon is like 42 kilometers, 26 miles. I don't understand those people.
That used to be me. But not anymore. Welcome to the Marathon Podcast. My name is Christian Warwick. Warwick runs on Instagram, YouTube. Really happy to have you here. In today's episode, we're having Andrejs with us, who is an HR expert. At least that's what we ended up talking the most about. He's been doing a lot of crazy things, like doing all the 7 marathons in 7 continents in 7 days. He's a former kayaker. And so we had a lot of interesting things to talk about, but we ended up kind of focusing the most on HR, which I thought was super interesting, super fun to be able to discuss those things with a former professional athlete and now a coach. So I hope that you will learn a lot about heart rate, how to use it for your training, what kind of intensity to focus more on. So that is today's episode. I'm not going to talk too much today. I've been feeling kind of weird lately. My body's been a bit off, so I haven't been able to run much since the last episode. I had to just stop my workout on Saturday and just been taking it easy since. But one thing that I wanted to touch on is that right now, for a very limited time until Tuesday, the Marathon Podcast has I just showed the hat here, by the way. The Marathon Podcast had $20 off for a very limited time until next Tuesday. So Tuesday, 19th of February, you can get $20 off. I'm just going to remind you that you can get that on themarathonpodcast.com. That means that for those of you in the US, you're barely paying anything for shipping. And like I talked about previously in the last episode, I'm not making much money on this, but the profit that I'm getting on the first 300 hats here will go directly back to the Marathon Podcast sponsorship. So with that, I think we're just going to jump to the conversation with Andrejs. Okay, Andrejs, welcome to the Marathon Podcast.
Thank you, Christian. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to have you here as well. And when I was looking at your Instagram profile, you have a list of things there in your bio, which I found very intriguing. You are an author. You have done the world race where you have 7 marathons in 7 continents in 1 week. You have been a professional sprint kayaker, and you also, I guess you're saying yourself that you're an HR expert, and I'm very curious to hear more about that. How is it to have so many hats, if we can call it that? Like you seem to know a lot about a lot of things. You have a lot of interests.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm a very curious person, if you can say so, and it has been quite a roller coaster. So in my sprint kayaking career, there was a lot of ups and downs, and then in transitioning to running and triathlon, there were quite a few downs, even though I expected them to be ups with my experience and knowledge. But I was always curious to how can I improve myself, and how basically everything that I've done previously, how does it translate into everyday life, but also in a different sport.
Yeah. And I guess like to understand how you got to where you are, I'm also very curious to hear more about your book, The Resilient Athlete. We have to go back to where you're from, what your life has been like growing up, and also how you got into sprint kayaking, because that's not really a sport that you hear that much about, I guess.
It's a very kind of closed community, because it's not so um, not like available, but it's logistically very challenging, because there are certain places where you can do it, and it's not like you can travel with your boat and your paddle, because a boat is a 5-meter long one, so it has to stay always in a place and you need an open source of water. So it's kind of, I was lucky to be roughly 20 minutes away from a river where we have a base, as we called it. And then all of my friends from school were part of that group, and it was kind of at, what was it, age 9 or 10 usually when we started kayaking. Everyone all of a sudden went to try, and then we had a very fun group there of I think there was like 8 of us or something, and it was just a fun way to spend the summer. But then after summer came autumn, and then a lot of the people stayed. So for a couple of years, we sort of trained. And at that point of time, it's not like, let's say, elite training. It's more like a lot of games, a lot of time on the water, a lot of swimming, a lot of stuff. So that's also what I write in my book as kind of to being a well-rounded athlete. So you do a bunch of different things and challenge yourself differently. But then somewhere around maybe ages 14, 15, the competitiveness started to kind of, naturally grow inside of me that, oh, there are like all of these people. And I think by that point of time, were maybe 2 of our old group that stayed. And then we started kind of racing each other during training. And then there were obviously all of the races. I think we have around 6 to 8 races throughout the summer, different distances, different challenges, different kind of configurations. Sometimes you do it in a single, in a double, and then in a 4-seat boat. So all of it kind of a lot of variety, and was all very, very, very interesting. And then I remember this one particular year where a coach invited me to go on a spring training camp. It was somewhere in March. So that's where uh, like let's say more experienced athletes gather a lot of kilometers and then build their aerobic base. I knew nothing of it. Then when I came there, it was so hard. I was dead last behind everyone. And I think at that point of time, that coach from the national team thought, okay, this guy is not gonna like amount to anything. And then that whole experience kind of changed everything for me, because all this time I was kind of racing with my friends, and I was kind of, it was kind of, we beat each other every time. So it was kind of, there was no clear maybe growth trajectory for me as I saw it. But then I saw that, oh my God, everyone else is so much better, and they are improving and I'm stagnating. And throughout the entire year, I was doing like 2 or 3 sessions per day. I went jogging when I had free times, and then in summer we would typically have, I think, 10 to 12 sessions per week. So most of the days 2 sessions, I think 1 or 2 days 1 session, and then 1 day free. And then the next year I came to the same training camp, and I was like top 1 to 3 on all of the kind of time trials that we did. So that basically started this whole sprint kayaking, let's say, career. So came to national team. There were world, European championship. We even went to Universiade, which is Olympics for university students. I first thought like, oh my God, this sounds something like not too interesting. But then when we went, it was like literally an Olympic spirit. So entire city was closed. You were driven everywhere with buses, and you live in a kind of Olympic village with all of the athletes. And the fun part is that in our sport, 70% probably of the competitors from other countries were actually the world championship or an European championship level, because the sport is kind of more focused on 18 to maybe 27 years old. And now a bit more people kind of cross that 30-year-old barrier. But because it's a very explosive sport, very much VO2 max dominant, it attracts more younger talent. And kind of also the earlier you can get your base strength up, so the more you'll also be successful. So yeah, that was my sprint kayaking career in a nutshell. There are a lot of days when I felt like super strong at the top of my game, but then randomly next week after a very good training week, I felt flat and didn't know what was happening. All of a sudden there was like no power and anything. And at that age, you think, oh my God, like I'm losing it. So you train more and you get yourself into overtraining or overreaching at least. And there were so many times when kind of that roller coaster happened. Luckily, kayaking is not injury prone sport, but had I been a track athlete, probably that would be when I would be injured because in kayaking there is no vibration. There is like the only place you typically get injured is a shoulder because it kind of takes much of the load. But yeah, luckily I didn't have it.
Yeah, because my question when you're talking about this, because obviously I'm not very familiar with sprint kayaking. The only relationship that I have to kayaking is I've seen it in the Olympics. I've tried to do it myself, but that's more just like leisurely and for fun. What kind of qualities do you need to have, and what kind of physical skills is it that you need to do that? And also when you call it a sprint, that is something that I find interesting. We talked about cross country skiing before we started recording. Yesterday
Yeah,
they had the sprint distance. They were sprinting for 4 minutes. And like for
yeah.
me, coming from speed skating where sprint is 30 to 60 seconds, then it feels like, okay, so what is a sprint and what is that like in sprint kayaking?
Yeah, it's a bit of challenging in terms of branding, but sprint kayaking, it's kind of like sprint on skis in terms of duration. So the longest kind of official Olympic distance we have is 1,000 meter, and at the very pointy end, it takes around 3.5 minutes. At the slower end, like 4.5 minutes. So it is comparable to actually 1,500 on a track. Like if you would look at Ingebrigtsen's time, it's like 3:25, I think, is the record, and 3:25 is also the record on the in the 1,000. And then we have a 500, for which I think the kind of the pointy end is 135 to 140, which translate to like 800 on the track around that time. And then we have a sprint, which is 200, and that's around 32 seconds, something like this. So it's very much geared towards VO2 max rather than the kind of pure sprint. But because you are in a boat and you overcome resistance, it's a so-called strength endurance sport where you need a ton of power, but at the same time you need a ton of endurance. So you get like you take essentially the best of both worlds. So we need to, as a sprint kayakers, we need to do a ton of volume, and usually kind of in my top years it was around 3,000 kilometers, which at a pace of the average pace would be something like 6 minutes per kilometer, or like 10 kilometers per hour on average. That translates to a couple of hundred hours. So you need that, but at the same time, especially in winter, you need a lot of strength training. And strength training is not easy. It's more a combination of explosive power and CrossFit style workout. So our winters are far from easy. And when I tried actually CrossFit, it felt like a lot of people try CrossFit and it's like, or high rocks, they're like, oh my God, like I could throw up. I was like, okay, I've been doing this for probably 10 years already, so it's nothing special for me. So that's the kind of combination. So intensities are very, very high. And I think that is also where I kind of maybe got away with a lot of um, during training, that when we raced each other, we had a lot of volume to clear all of the lactate, clear all of the fatigue, to bring the heart rate down. But also when we were doing intervals, they were basically all of them were always at full power. And only later on, after I took a break and started reading about exercise physiology, about heart rate, about training strength periodization and started putting things in the right order, I started thinking more and more about intensity, and that is when things started to click. So that is when I was like, oh, I should have structured this out a little bit better. And there was a time actually, I think maybe when I was 20 or something, when kind of everything felt a bit too much. I got 2 cases of tonsillitis in a span of like 6 weeks, shortly before European Championship. So my form was, it was the best I've ever had going into it, but because at that kind of at that intensity and load, you are kind of in between um, fit and sideline. So you're threading the edge of the knife, and yeah, I was sideline essentially. I did start, but it was, yeah, I couldn't get out of the semifinals.
S- s-
Um,
So I think that it's really fun to hear, and I think that some people might also be a bit maybe surprised to hear that when you're doing or during a sport that's called sprint something, and like you said, it's like a 1500 meter. How surprised, or people will probably be very surprised to hear and understand how much endurance training you're doing. So I'm sure that, like you were talking about the 200 hours of kayaking, but I'm sure there were other forms of training that you were also doing. And um, we're gonna get I want to talk more about like the difference between the training that you were doing back then and what you're doing now. You are today a 2:49 marathoner, so you've kind of the racing time is much longer now for you with that, and also with uh, the races that you did all over the world in 2024. Like you're very much an endurance athlete, far from what you would call a sprinter. And I want to talk more about your running, the transition to running. But before we do, like now, I feel like we got to know the athlete Andrejs. But who is Andrejs outside of the sports? Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what are you doing today?
I grew up in Latvia, and when I started, when I finished university, I got let's say, invite to join this corporate leadership development program. And I moved to Germany. And from Germany, I moved to Indonesia, then Finland, then Hungary, basically back to Germany. So I've been around, and with my it actually very nicely correlates with my running journey, because that was when I had to make a decision. Okay, do I kind of continue becoming like elite kayaker, or do I switch something? And that is when I made the decision to let's say start working in a sense, and because it was, as I mentioned, logistically impossible. And even though kind of in most places you can find a place to kayak, to really be competitive, I'd say I needed like maybe 5 sessions per week, where I would do quality like 1.5 hours. And with logistics and everything, it was just too much that I could bear. And so as I was that was actually 2 very challenging years in terms of, let's say, mindset and um, yeah, basically trying to understand who am I outside of sport. And I really struggled with that. I went to the gym, I did some running, I did some biking. Basically, I went through the motions, and then kind of I felt something was missing. And then I, as many millennials do when they face like, what is it, quarter life crisis, if we can call it so, I signed up for a marathon because that was always on my bucket list. We had this Riga marathon, and it always coincided with the start of the kayaking season. So even though outside of kayaking we did a lot of running, we did a ton of cross country skiing. So typically we would do 1,000 kilometers throughout winter, besides all of the gym work and running that we do. So kind of we were brought up by our coach with with a massive confidence that we could excel at any sport. And we heard stories like people, the kayakers, they would go on cross country skis and they would win national championships. So that was the idea that were planted in our heads. And then all of a sudden, I was kind of here outside of sport, really not sure what to kind of, as if a part of my identity was missing. And then I signed up for first half marathon and then full marathon. And then I sort of got on this growth journey, but I realized I was at the very beginning. So I thought I can run a 3 hour marathon. I have the engine, I have the endurance. Like, uh, we would occasionally run 5K or 10K races, and I could break 20 minutes in a 5K back then, even though I was a kayaker, so it was not a kind of a big problem for us. So I figured like I can run a half marathon in 1.5 hours, which I did, and then I could run a 3 hour marathon. And then I trained for it, and it's a classic story of you start, and at kilometer 21 you're like, I'm on pace. It's 1 hour, 1 hour 30. My heart rate is 175, a bit too high, but there's no way I'm not finishing. And 4K later, it's like slowly going down. I still show this graph to all of my people and athletes that I coach, like, don't do that. So I finished, I think it was 390. So first half was 130, second half was whatever there is 49 or something. But I didn't stop. I mean, I shuffled, but I didn't stop. And then this kind of opened up a whole new chapter in terms of how to train and all of that. And I started taking all of my training journals, which I wrote by hand or in Excel later on, the moment I got the first Polar watch. So I was like meticulous about what we did, what was my heart rate, what was the time, and basically put out all of the details. And then I basically took those journals and started analyzing the patterns, like what works, what doesn't work, and then started to apply it, and then saw my kind of performance improving. And that whole thing kind of put me on a, let's say, totally new trajectory. I found again meaning behind training, behind what I was doing. And I started this blog called the Athlete Blog, where I basically started putting what kind of how am I training, and more importantly, why I do it. Because I got a few kind of questions like, oh, kind of what I did and kind of how I'm improving. So I put it there, and for the people to read. And that's basically started, let's say, my writing career. And you asked at the very beginning about this heart rate training expert. So I wrote this big post. I think it was 3,000 or 4,000 word post, where I basically laid out all of the heart rate zones, what they train, how to train them, how to calculate them, and basically how to adjust. And for a long time, it was, if you would type in Google heart rate training, that was the first thing that would show up. Now with all of the
Wow.
content management and everything, there are quite a few other posts, there are quite a few videos, but basically back then, which was, I don't know what, 5 or 7 years ago, that was the only, let's say, source where people can find it. And that comes from all of this analysis that I did, all of the knowledge I also accumulated throughout my kayaking, running, and triathlon journey. And in kayaking, we used to do at least twice a year functional testing in a lab. So you would do the VO2 max analysis, you would do the lactate testing, so the step up test. And I have like a whole folder of those VO2 max tests. I can pull up something that I did in 2007 when I first did it, or something when I did in like 2000, I think 13, in my one of my best years, and analyze that. And also there was this one year where I did like a lot of training, a lot of high intensity training, and I thought I'm doing everything right, but then on paper, so the sports physiologist, she looked at the two graphs, like, did you even like do something different? It looks like, they're completely the same. And I was like, oh my God, I just invested this entire year into pushing myself hard, and that in a sense didn't result in anything. So that was that year when I took a break, and I started analyzing, reanalyzing, putting the different, let's say, patterns together. That's when I learned also about strength training periodization. So it's not only that you go and do 3 sets of 10, there's a whole methodology in how you periodize your strength to support your training. And the next year already, like in winter, it was a completely different game. And then in summer, actually, that was when I broke that kind of goal that I set for myself. I always wanted to break, I think, was it 355 or 352 maybe? Because we have in Latvia, we have this classification. You would have a master of sports, candidate. I think it's back from USSR times. So we have a master, master candidate, and you have first, second, and third kind of level. So the faster you are, the closer you are to that master. I think it was 347, I think, or 348 was a master's benchmark. And then candidate was something like 355 or so. And in that summer, actually, I wanted to always break 355, but I went, I think, 344 or 343.
Wow.
So on a track, again, it's comparable. The 1,000 meters is very comparable to the track. So it would be the same in the track, or in mile, I calculated it was as if I would lower my mile time from something like 417 or 418 down to like 401, 403 area. So
Wow.
just
So,
to give a bit of a comparison, only because I restructured my training based on these patterns, based on the to a large extent this heart rate, let's say, science, but
mhm.
mostly because I finally started to take things seriously instead of just training hard and training more.
Wow.
And
So
that is when the book was kind of, the idea for the book also was created.
yeah, and we'll get back to the book, but I'm very curious to hear more about like the findings that, or the things that you learn from the heart rate. I guess like more structure in your heart rate. And I don't know about you, but at least for me, having this podcast, talking to a lot of runners, I'm kind of surprised coming from a sport where heart rate was always like a tool that we used so much in our training to make sure that we were at the right intensity. The coaches would always ask about the heart rate. And then in running, a lot of people's approach is just to run by feel or use pace more. And I'm not criticizing that, because it seems that like most professionals are doing that and it really works for them. But I do think that some people, especially when you are entering running for the first time, you could benefit from having more of a relationship to heart rate, whether or not you use it on a daily basis. Just at least know that, okay, these are my zones, this is what it should be like. And if you were to give us like a quick overview, I guess like a little bit based on the article you were referring to, and if you try to make it a bit running specific, just because most of the listeners are obviously runners, what are the most important things that you would communicate or talk about when it comes to the heart rate?
So just to give a bit of maybe perspective, and kind of a lot of it is based on the science that we have back from like the 70s with the cyclists and the runners. So it was kind of even back from the 2020 minus age to determine your maximum. But to give a bit of a perspective, in kayaking, most of our training was field based, because kayaking, at least where we were, was quite distant from this whole kind of, let's say, not necessarily science, but all of the like gadgets and everything. So I only got heart rate monitor, I think, when I was age 18, and that blew my mind. So I started tracking meticulously tracking everything, because we didn't even have GPS. So our coach would say, okay, so we do let's say interval from here to that tree and back. And that would be kind of how the intervals were supposed. Or like today we're working 10 times 3 minutes at 80% intensity, and then go figure what is 80% intensity. You never know. You try to relate all to your feelings. And the problem is that when you have like your partners that race next to you or train next to you, you always kind of those 80% turn into 90, 95. So during my those VO2 max tests, I spent like 4 hours at every appointment just talking with the exercise physiologist to try to figure out. So the way I approach it, the way I understand this, is kind of we have 5 zones in a 5 zone model. There are models with 3 zones. There are models with 4 zones. Actually, that is when I started. And uh, my coach used to say, okay, so I do it in zone 2, but zone 2 was 140 to 160. So zone 1 was 120 to 1. So it was based to fixed sort of amount. There was no variety. But then I learned about the Karvanen, Mighty Karvanen formula, where you use your maximum heart rate and your resting heart rate to determine your heart rate reserve, and then you take the percentages from that. And because it's mm, aggregated from thousands of laboratory tests, it's much more reliable. It always is kind of based on the maximum heart rate. So it's kind of a person needs to have a certain understanding of their physiology and be flexible to actually move things a little bit. So we have 5 zones. Zone 1 is your recovery zone, and zone 2 is your aerobic zone. Zone 3 is a moderate intensity. Zone 4 is threshold, and then zone 5 is VO2 max. But it's kind of the devil is in the detail. So if a person does a lactate test, kind of a classic, let's say, Western approach is to have your LT1 and LT2, and then depending on the kind of what you kind of the data you get, a lot of people take 2 and 4, because it again aggregates a lot of people. And for a person who just starts training, it maybe makes sense, because for them they already carry quite a bit of fatigue and intensity. But a very well trained athlete, for him to be at those 2 and 4 means he already goes through a ton of intensity, because his lactate clearance is much better. So the approach where I was brought up with, let's say, focuses on aerobic and anaerobic threshold. So the aerobic threshold is a bit kind of further back from LT1. That's actually the point where you just start to accumulate lactate, not necessarily where it is, let's say, already 1.5 or 1.9, but actually where it kind of, for a person, maybe they run very slowly or jog, their lactate goes down to, let's say, maybe 0.8 or 0.7. And then the moment it's kind of stays level, and then the moment it starts to elevate, that's the aerobic threshold, and that's the onset of zone 2. And then from there, while the lactate still is relatively low, typically it's anywhere from 14 to 18 beats of heart rate. That would be the end of zone 2. And then your zone 4 would be where your threshold is. So that is classic, where the line starts to kind of exponentially rise. That's always kind of linked to the LT1. So knowing those 2 points, you can set your zones very clearly. So you have your zone 1, everything until that lactate even starts to increase. And this is where recovery training, many athletes I see are doing their recovery runs too fast, that they target the LT1 for everything below LT1 for their recovery. But for a, let's say, 249 marathoner or 245 marathoner, that their LT1 might be somewhere around, like 430, 440, might feel easy, but mechanically and metabolically, it's not what is happening. So it doesn't allow for full, let's say, lactate clearance. Back in our sprint kayaking day, our recovery training was done at like 110 beats per minute. So we were just kind of barely moving. And what I found also in running, and in this my last block for Riga, where I finally did my 249, what I did is I did a hard session, and then the next day I did it in my in my view, I did it old school. So I went and my heart rate went like 120, 125, so deep into zone one, just to ensure that I spin the legs and help that lactate to clear. So that's kind of the power of that zone one. But also with zone two, it's and again it's classic zone two in the 5-zone model, not the moderate intensity or what is it, high intensity domain in a three zone model. So that is when we have the bottom of zone two and top of zone two. And ideal, a person would have the pulmonary data where they see how their fat oxidation changes. And past Pogacar's course, Nicholson Milan mentioned that the top of zone two is typically when your fat oxidation starts to drop. So for a strong athlete, you typically would have a curve where fat oxidation increases, or it spikes in the beginning and then stays level. And then at one point of time, it will start decreasing. So the better athlete you are, the higher you can maintain that oxidation. But the point where it decreases is typically around the top of zone two. So knowing that, you can kind of know approximately where your zone two is. But in reality, it doesn't matter if you do top of zone two or bottom of zone two training for your base mileage. It will improve your training either way, because that is kind of primarily focused on stretching the heart muscle and then improving the stroke volume and basically making your ligaments and muscles overall strong to sustain the load. So that's why people who are trying to go from, like, let's say 30 miles to 60 and 70 miles, they struggle even though they're running at zone two, because they're running at the top of zone two. And at that point of time, you're probably using 30% more of carbs. And then 1 week is okay, 2 weeks is okay, but then you're kind of creating these small dents in the glycogen reserve that by week 3 or 4, you're gradually starting to fatigue. And this is where injuries start to happen. So in my Boston block, I went through during the period from September, I think, till November or December. I went from something like 30 or 40K, what I did kind of without any structure after the rest period from Riga Marathon, up to 110 kilometers without any issues, because the base of those kilometers was run at like 125, 130 heart rate. So basically zone one, zone two, or low zone two. And
Yeah,
then
and
we have, yeah.
this is very. I love hearing this, and I feel like for me at least, the last month kind of confirms all of this in my own training, where I've seen that, like you said, especially for me, I have a pretty like big zone one. My zone two is not that big, or like the range is so big on my zone one, and so I realized that uh, just by staying in the lower zone one for a lot of my easy runs, right? Like, and I think that I'm curious to hear your take on this too, like recovery runs versus just easy runs, if there is a difference. But anyways, in terms of increasing that mileage, which a lot of us runners are obviously trying to do, I've seen that the greatest impact that I've had on, or the biggest factor that has kind of changed my ability to get to that higher mileage has been that lower zone one. So instead of having an average heart rate of say 130, I have 115 to 120. And that difference is like you do feel like you're running pretty slow on your easy runs, and in some ways by doing this you might feel like you're not having the same progress because you're like, oh my god, I'm running so
Yeah.
slow. But then in terms of the risk of injuries, in terms of also the performance, because I've seen that I'm really performing better on the harder days as well. And so uh, I've seen this, like, had the same experience over the last months, the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
uh, but then it does make me curious, like back to what I just said about like the recovery runs versus the easy runs. Do you differentiate those?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So here it's important to remember, and you're in that category as well. So kind of top end athletes, faster athletes, athletes who have a lot of experience, let's say, in the sport. Progress for them doesn't come from zone two training. Zone two is just base maintenance. Progress for elite and faster athletes comes from going through more training load, but going through more specific training load. So you maybe heard of this Niels van der Poel person who broke the record, won 2 Olympic golds, and then retired, posting his training program.
Yeah,
And
crazy
if you,
guy.
yeah, and if you look at it, it's super boring. So you have a lot of kind of base session, but the important part there is in his competition phase, he was focused on running on skating. What was it, 30-second lap or something?
Yeah,
So
he
at
did
race,
very race specific. So a lot of his training on ice, which is like, obviously ice is very specific for speed skaters. We don't do as much as you would think. But what
yeah,
Nils did was that all of the hard work that he did would be race specific. So
yeah,
as
exactly,
so like if he was able to do 10 laps at 30 seconds per
yeah,
lap, which was his targeted pace for his race, then he would
yeah,
do 10 laps. If he was able to do 12, then he would do 12. It was kind of, yeah, it was super specific. And then, like you said, a crazy amount of hours. Like he trained 5 days a week, but then he would have seven
yeah,
hours a
exactly.
day on those
But
5 days.
yeah, and the critical piece here is that he would stop his ice practice when he would drop off the 30-second per lap pace. So obvious, and and he mentions it in the program that he has a very good form, so his form is optimized. And that is also kind of, that's a topic for another podcast. Basically, his years of let's say honing his form and technique. But the important part here is that progress for runners at the higher ability will come from um, doing harder days harder. That means that Mm, I know a lot of people struggling to improve their marathon times because they arrive at their long run uh, tired or under fueled or don't have fuel with them, so they cannot go through more training load. They're kind of stuck in this, let's say, kind of zone three, which feels already tiring. But if you look at like Olympians or people who are chasing a 2:30 to 20 marathon, you look at the long run session, you're like, how is it possible to do it? Obviously, there's a little bit of a mindset piece to it, but the important part is that they optimize their training for those harder days. Like Kipchoge, he published many years ago his Berlin marathon, like last 2 weeks leading to Berlin marathon. Basically, he was doing, I think, 30K fartlek at race intensity 1 week, and then 40K fartlek the next week. And then like he would do a lot of high intensity and very, very focused training. And then the rest is just kind of base mileage. Doesn't really kind of is not really important. But I'm pretty sure that in those base miles, his beginning was very, very slow. Actually, in many books, it's written that Kenyans, Ethiopians, they would start their easy runs at like 8 minute pace or 7 minute pace. So they're just like slogging. But then as they go through those zones, their kind of their form starts to reappear, tightness evaporates, and then they speed it up toward that. And that is another thing that is important for also developing runners is and something I work a lot on myself. It's really the form. We have so many like influencers, let's call them so, or amateur athletes who like do crazy amount of hours, like often 10, 15 hours to improve their running. They log in like 150, 160K weeks, and they can only go maybe 250, 240, maybe some do 230. But you take an, let's say, average middle distance runner, and without kind of much specific training. I actually met a person a couple of years ago who was a 800-meter runner, and then he did like a mini training block for a marathon, and he ran at 239 without a lot of 32K runs. I think he only ran 30K once, so he didn't know what he was, but because his form is so efficient, so when he runs, he bounces, and all of it is optimized. He has much lower oxygen cost, and that is something that really can affect. It's like if I would get in a kayak now and would have someone who is kind of who maybe worked out for like 2 or 3 years to be able to handle that narrow kayak. uh, I wouldn't need much energy, let's say, or much training or power to go faster than him or her, because I have this muscle memory. My form is very much dialed in through years of training, and the same applies to running. So those harder days, they are one, of course, to improve the lactate threshold and endurance and all of that, but to a large extent to actually work on the form. So those harder, like VO2 max kind of sessions, it's it's not maybe so important to hit a certain pace, like I did yesterday, for example, 10 times 500. And on some of them, I wasn't hitting the pace, but also when I was running, my left side was a little bit tight, and I was aware of it. So that was something I felt like had a bit more kind of warmed up, it's kind of my pace would have been better. But because it's so much faster, there is more opportunity to work on the leg swing, on the butt kick, on basically being more in the air and being light on the feet, and that is what translates ultimately then to marathon. So I think it's yeah, for someone in, let's say, 3 hour to 330 range, if they have been struggling to kind of, let's say, go to a next level, that's one very big area that can be improved. Like, pick up
Yeah.
the arms a little bit higher, try to activate hamstrings more so that the leg swing is more efficient. I think in one of the books also they analyzed, was it Ethiopians or Kenyan runners, and they came down to like funny conclusion that if your ankle is narrower, you can be a better runner, because that is the one thing kind of that increases the cost of running, because
Uh-huh.
you have a kind of um, smaller pendulum or lighter pendulum that you need to swing. And that was a funny conclusion, but it helps to illustrate the fact what kind of demands uh, runners runners face and what they can optimize.
And I totally agree with you. And I think that for the two of us coming from what I would call pretty like technical sports, right? Like we are focusing on the details, like as a speed skater. And I'm sure it's the same with kayaking, that there are so many technical things that you can do that can compensate for the lack of hours of training, right? Like I had teammates who would not be even close to my fitness, but they would still skate faster than me because they were technically better than me. Uh, but I also feel like for a lot of runners, and especially people entering running at a later stage in life, say, I think that a lot of the people listening to this, I don't know their marathon times, but I'm sure there's a range between like 220 marathoners, maybe faster marathoners than that too, up to the like first time marathoners who are just they just want to finish a marathon, like a 5 hour marathon, get through that, or maybe they're seeking some improvement or progress in the marathon distance. And so, like, the technical part, like you said, that is very important. That is also something that you might need to seek a coach to help you out, have someone give you feedback on that. But then the easier things, the things that you and I can kind of just talk about here that people can implement in their training, is like you were talking about the intensity in terms of zone 1, zone 2. A lot of people are talking about this, like, I feel like everywhere where I look, people are like, what is up with zone 2 training? Why are people talking so much about that? Why can't you just do, like, I saw someone asking about zone 3 training, like, why can't you just do all your training in zone 3? And then people were talking about, oh, that's because then there's a bigger risk of injuries. And in my opinion, I'm like, well, yes, there's a bigger chance of injuries, but I also feel like, back to what you were saying, you won't really be ready for that hard workout if you're doing zone 3 for all of your runs, because then you might be tired, you might not have the energy in you to actually perform on the workout days, but also the race days. So for you, in terms of, I guess first, just like a very quick definition: if a person is, or a runner is running, say, 4 to 5 times a week, and you were talking about the recovery run versus the easy run, like, how many recovery runs would you have, and how many easy runs would you have if you differentiate those?
So for 4 to 5 training days per week, and actually I on many occasions I train 5 times per week. Now that I'm trying to get for Boston closer to like 110 average, it's pretty challenging to collect everything in 5 days. But on 90 kilometers per hour, I did five training days. So what I would do is the first we have, yeah, I would always have a one hard day and one long day. So those are kind of, anyone can manage that. And then ideally hard day would be followed by a proper zone 1 day. So for example, I did yesterday a hard workout. Today I will go purely in zone 1. I don't care about the pace. I just kind of would spin the legs. Had I trained for a triathlon, that would probably mean like a 1 hour spin at the bike, I don't know, 100 watts, just to get the legs moving. So what it helps is it helps to clear the lactate and then speed up all of the waste process removal, because our limb system doesn't have a pump like our heart rate, our heart and cardiovascular system does. So if we don't move, we don't clear the waste effectively. That's why, I mean, funny story, but that's why hangovers linger for an entire day if you spend it at home, or it's like gone in 1 or 2 hours if you go out and like go for a brisk walk, because you're moving the limbs and lymph is stimulated. Um, yeah, so that is that is important. So after those 2 days, this kind of back-to-back hard day followed by super easy day, the third day can be what I call like a base day. So it can be anywhere from like a bottom to mid zone 2 to higher zone 2. And the higher the, let's say, caliber of athletes, then more sort of zone 3 work can be included. So it can be a bunch of like tempo repeats in a fartlek fashion. But for most of the people, it would be just the zone 2, traditional zone 2, where you can go higher zone 2, or you can go lower, or you can kind of do a run on a undulating terrain where it naturally will go up and down. And on those days, you typically can feel the effect of a faster training. So if, let's say, Monday is off, then Tuesday will be a hard day. Then Wednesday, you will feel that you will be slower, your heart rate will be higher. That's totally normal. That's part of the process. But then on that, let's say, zone 2 or base day, you will feel that most probably your base pace is a little bit upbeat, because you have this neural system stimulation. You know how to use your limbs more effectively. As they say, you cannot run fast with poor form. it translates very much into base phase. So we have 3 days of running, then there would be 1 day of rest, or it can be like a mini strength training or something. Then you do another run that would be pre-long run that would activate you after a day of rest, and it can be a run like 40 minutes. I typically do lower zone 2 with some strides towards the end. It can be longer 1 minute stride, but then it would be closer to threshold pace, or it can be very, very fast, up to 20-second strides, like 4 to 6. And then you have a long day. So that's 5 days of training, very, very quality stuff. And if you days, then you can squeeze in a third workout, which would be, then you can play around that you have 1 day, you have more, let's say, anaerobic type of work. You can do like 30-second repeats, like 20 times 200s, or you do 200s, 400s, something like this. And then you do more of kind of threshold tempo type of training. And then you have the long run. So it will all depend on where you are in the plan. So if you are in the base phase, you will benefit a ton from doing a lot of short, intense work to improve your economy, to improve your stride, and get your, let's say, anaerobic power and conditioning a little bit higher, because you will lose it naturally. That's totally normal. But you will lose that top end conditioning as you start doing more kind of endurance, this moderate intensity zone 3 kind of stuff during your long runs and during the threshold work. So it helps to build it up a little bit in the beginning so that you have kind of higher, let's say, base to start from.
Yeah. And this is also like, obviously what you're talking about now is what a lot of people call like summer of speed, winter of speed, where they are trying to get faster. And like I was listening to a podcast yesterday or the other day where Rory Linkletter was talking about he needs that marathon pace to not feel fast. Like, but by being faster in the shorter distances, he will be able to feel like marathon pace is not really fast, because if he feels like the marathon pace is too intimidating, that's not going to help him from a mental or a physical perspective. But I'm curious because you did mention that athletes who've been at a certain level before, like first of all, you have the muscle memories that will help you, and also the way of improving will be to just add load, which is, I guess, something that I realized myself, especially with my first marathon block. I realized that, oh, just by moving, like whether I'm doing zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, it doesn't really matter. I'm having progress, right? Like I'm getting faster, I'm getting better. And that's probably how I got through that first marathon block. That's how I was able to run that 2:52 for my first marathon without any like running experience, without any marathon experience, without a coach, nothing, just like moving. And it was not a perfect block at all, but I started training again, and that helped me. And coming from a place where like a couple of years earlier, previously, I've been at a high, like I had my fitness was really good. That helped me. But I've been trying to, whenever I'm talking to people, I realize that maybe I'm taking a bit too much that like my own situation, my own history into account when I'm talking about what people should do or what I think they should do. So from my perspective, I'm like, you rarely need to hit zone 4 and 5 in order to improve in the marathon distance. Like that is what I've been saying, that you like obviously you can't have the majority of your training in that zone, those zones anyways. But my take would be like, well, if you do zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3, it will give you the progress in the marathon distance. But I'm not
Yeah.
sure if but
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm saying that because I know that really works for me and that is my experience. And so, like, if we were to look at it from a perspective of someone who hasn't been running before or who's not an athlete, how much do they need to do in zone 3 and 4? And also, how much of their training should be in zone 3?
Mhm. So just maybe a bit of a prelude here. We have good examples that you don't need more than volume and strides to improve. I think there was, at one point of time, there was an article about this Japanese person, Yuki Kawauchi, that his training is super simple. He runs 20K every day, and that's it without any specific speed work. And he won Boston. So, and he, I think, is the person who has run the most sub 220 marathons or something like this.
Yeah, I
And then
think
at the
more than
same time,
100.
yeah. And I just start now coaching one lady who is a 244 or 245 marathoner in New York, which is a hilly course. And as I review her training, there is no kind of traditional where you do like 10K at race pace. She just did a lot of volume, and that also improved it, because ultimately the more volume, the difference, let's say, between an Olympic runner and a regular runner is that Olympic runner built himself so that he can withstand much more training load. So if we can kind of reverse engineer it and focus on, can I do slightly more this week? And this can be, I squeeze in another strength session because it helps to stabilize myself so that I go through more training load. Back in our sprint kayaking days, we always had this kind of yearly totals, and kind of I can clearly see where I was when I was doing 1800 kilometers versus 3000. So let's say 2500 got me to like a European and world championship, and then 3000 was when I did all of my personal best. And here it's important to remember that our fitness is like a giant funnel. So uh, for a beginner, someone who is starting out, so you throw anything in, it will work. Cycling, running, walking, stand-up paddling, stairmaster, going to the gym, everything will work to get the person better overall and moving better. But then as the person becomes faster, that funnel starts to narrow. So it becomes less and less and less. And that's why I say for a kind of an elite runner going for 1 hour easy run, it's like it's kind of, at most it's maintenance. That's why I mentioned earlier that at the higher end, people typically would add some strides or some like easy fart like into their easy runs just to kind of stimulate themselves a little bit better. So here it's kind of the focus I try to get people into is that they should just get themselves moving better and moving more, because overall training volume is what is at the core of exercise physiology. This um, progressive overload, that we do more. We either run faster or we run more or we do more exercise. So for beginners, and this is very important to kind of develop this relationship with yourself, with your body, to listen where the body starts to kind of whisper. So person went for a run, I don't know, for 1 hour, felt as a good workout, but then next day calves start to hurt. So that's a good indicator that it was a little bit too much. You don't want to get in like a, let's say, severe pain or severe muscle soreness and things like that. And when kind of, that's why building this training load takes quite a bit of time. That for many people, it's even coached athletes, it's a little bit like you have a corridor and then you walk through this dark corridor and you bump into the walls. Unless you kind of adjust your direction, you're still moving forward. So the same is here. Kind of a person went for a run, he has calves hurt. Okay, why calves hurt? Because I used my calves more. So kind of, it's good to scale down the intensity and maybe focus kind of to get that distance to something that is can be repeated, let's say, every week or every other day, and in between also strengthen the calves. But most of the kind of beginner and amateur athletes, they don't think like that. So a professional athlete has it ingrained in him that the approach kind of, it's never from here to here, and it's a straight line. And if somewhere in the middle of straight line I feel something is off, I continue pushing. So for an athlete, it's always kind of a little bit of a roller coaster going up and down, and sometimes you need to go way down because a person made a mistake somewhere here that he didn't listen, that okay, my kind of Achilles or hamstring was a little bit not okay, but then I still did a hard 2 hour run, and then he or she is paying for that 2 weeks into the future. So my advice for people would be to really listen to themselves, become like a detective,
Yeah.
and learn a little bit what is it that the body is whispering. And especially about injuries, there is, I think it's a relatively new term, it's called prehab. So
Mm-hmm.
it's basically you do all of the activities as if you were coming back from an injury, but you do it before you're actually injured in that area. So that's what I actively do. If I develop some sort of a niggle, like I would Google and kind of try to understand what kind of let's say injury it is, even though there might be just discomfort, not
Yeah.
even pain. Then I educate a little bit about myself. So if it's like shin splints, okay, like which is typical for many beginners, it's usually because when a person runs, he or she doesn't feel it, but the ankle does a lot of flexion and dorsiflexion, so that puts a lot of strain on the legs. But the way and kind of the way to recover is to let it rest. But also, as I mentioned, you need the kind of blood flow, and you need to strengthen, because that is what where injuries happen. The body finds a weak spot, and it accumulates all of the load there. And if we proactively find where is that weak spot that prevents us from building more, then we can early on start to work on it to allow us to go through more training load. And from there we can just take the Yuki's approach and build ourselves to take on more training load.
Yeah. And what you're saying there is, first of all, I love hearing the metaphors that you have in terms of that corridor, or in terms of like meeting challenges or facing challenges, and then kind of be like, okay, I have to adjust a little bit here. I think too many of us, myself included, we tend to be so obsessed with the plan that we made for ourselves, or someone made for ourselves and for us, and then we're like, well, I have to kind of keep going. Okay, I'm feeling a niggle, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling sick, but I still do have to get my long run in. But I am also curious about, so for you, coming from a sport where you used to compete for, like what you said, 3 to 4 minutes, for instance, and now we're talking about the marathon distance, which is like 2 hours for most people. It will be more than, obviously more than 2 hours. So like, if we were to say between 2 hours for the pros and then like 6-7 hours for the ones who are running on the slower end, I feel like the difference in training between the 3 to 4 minute racing or competition time and the 7 hours, like it's a huge difference, right? And my experience, or like what I was taught when I was a speed skater, was that like the longer the racing time, the less you need at that super high intensity, like VO2 max, because you might not even get to use the VO2 max in the same way as you would have if you were like racing for 3 to 4 minutes, right? Because you don't need as much of it. That is very simply put, because you obviously need to have the VO2 max, and the higher VO2 max, the bigger or greater your capacity is. But
Yes.
uh, I feel like we do see that the pros, they are also racing like 5Ks, 10Ks, half marathons before their actual marathon race, and that's where they're probably getting a lot of that zone 4 or 5, because that's racing intensity. If we were
Yeah.
to look at like the zone 4, 5 compared to zone 3 for marathoners, what is your take on that? Like, where would you Like, yeah, what are your thoughts on zone 3 versus 4 and 5?
Um, it needs to be part of a balanced training plan so that I can tell for sure. The amount of it obviously can vary, but if we come back to that discussion that we need to periodize, so in the winter we would do some short bursts and everything. It's besides improving the training form, it also improves, ironically, our oxygen utilization. So when we do short bursts of speed in quick succession, like you would do, let's say, 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, or like various different model. I think Norwegians actually played a lot with it, with this Moxie monitor and oxygen saturation. It actually becomes a very much aerobic session when you do these bursts of speed in quick succession with very little recovery time. So because you're running so fast, you're emptying your oxygen, let's say, reserves in the muscle, and then as you stop it immediately replenishes, so it trains the body to first of all use oxygen, which improves your VO2 max, which is your, let's say, ceiling for the endurance sports. And the higher ceiling you have, the more your lower end training will feel easier, um, and the more kind of benefit it will give you. But yeah, I would say for endurance training, it's not maybe too important where and how you actually do it, as long as you do it, let's say, at least once every 10 days in a 10-day cycle. Because there's also a saying, like, there are two conflicting sayings that go slower to go faster, it works. And then there's also saying, if you always go slow, you will always be slow. So I think there is a certain group, let's say, of runners or marathoners who are like, I'm going slow, I'm not going I'm not getting any faster. And this is kind of where it's important to incorporate this faster running, so that, with zone 2 and all of the aerobic based training, we build our amount of mitochondria, amount of the kind of strength of the cardiovascular system. So we're gradually kind of getting faster, but we forget about the higher intensity part. So we build our zone 2, let's say so, and then we invest it into higher intensity to actually be able to run faster. And then that raises our ceiling. So our zone 2 actually becomes even faster. Because the reason for this periodization, that we first build the base and then we build, let's say, the speed or more specific, let's say, marathon specific intensity, is when our muscles are more saturated with mitochondria, we also process the lactate much quicker. So if you get a person started like first or second training and you get them to do 400s, they probably do, I don't know, maybe four very fast, and they're like, I'm done. But then once you get person build his aerobic base, in that minute that he or she finishes the 400, their heart rate would drop, and their recovery from that, so the utilization of those hydrogen ions and all of the intensity and lactate would be much faster. So they can do not 4 times 400, but 20 times 400, for example. And by that, they would elicit much bigger training load on themselves, and therefore they will become much stronger. So they will have more power in their run. They will be um, they would essentially improve more. So even though it's not necessary, and again, there's no like one size fits all. Like, this is a golden rule, you have to follow it, otherwise you will fail. So like, Yuki just runs fast base runs, and I know there are people who are running like a marathon every week. They do like 50 or even hundreds of marathons per year, and they still improve because they incorporate it into their training. But what I actually haven't mentioned yet, and it's actually a big thing, the biggest differentiator in how we adapt to training, it comes not from the training itself. So we talked a lot about kind of what specific training to do when, but it's actually nutrition and recovery. And the reason we've seen all of the like records being broken, especially in triathlon, like in Kona when they lower it now to into 740s, and everywhere else it's basically marathon is now very close to being 2 hours being broken. It comes down primarily because of fueling, not necessarily super shoes. There is a little bit maybe a component, but it's mostly nutrition during the race, but also nutrition during training. So that's what I meant. Kind of how are we showing up for our key training session under fueled and kind of operating on vibes, or are we were there to put our body through more training load. And if we look at zones 1, 2, 3, then very kind of we have this discussion earlier that kind of training all the time in zone 3 is not really good. I mean, there are people who have quite a bit of success with that, but you need a lot of carbs for that because your fat utilization is not that high. So if a person carb loads like every day, eats, I don't know, probably 7 grams of carbs per kilo every day, then they would be able to sustain that intensity. It's just there are more effective ways to do it. So that's something also to mention, that if a person is not able to kind of even stick to the training plan or kind of get through this progressive overload, there's a very high chance at some point of time that person is under fueling. And that was my kind of experience as well when I looked back at my kayaking session, to kind of to bring it to a full close. Now that I look back at my days, when some weeks I was on top of the world and then another week I was completely flat, even though training wise not much has changed. Now I realize that on the weeks when I was completely flat, probably 1 or 2 of the harder days I didn't eat enough, and didn't eat enough carbs. So, and I remember there were days when I'm so hungry that what I eat was toast with honey on it, like 4 of those. So it's like pure sugar. And if you pay attention to it, your body communicates to you. So usually, like if you are tired, like you're under fueling. If you feel like you want chips or something, you're probably lacking electrolytes or sodium. So
Yeah,
that's yeah.
these are very interesting things to also consider. And I think that what you were saying is that, like, especially like based on how you're fueling, you can obviously do more of that higher intensity work, especially up to zone 3. And I guess that a lot of us, we don't really think about whether you spent more time in zone 2 or 3 in terms of your nutrition. You think of the workout. And sometimes, or especially in the beginning when you're running, before you've hit that like runner's high where you're feeling good and everything is or you can control your intensity zones more, we will most likely hit zone 3 for a lot of what we think of as our easy runs, right? And so you get back and you're like, oh, today was just an easy run because you had that on your training plan, like your coach prescribed
Yeah.
that for you, or you said to yourself, this was an easy run, I don't need to fuel as much. But then if you had 25% or 30% of that in zone 3, the fueling is actually essential to like recovering from that work session or easy run if you call it that. But like I think this is something that a lot of us will neglect and maybe not pay enough attention to. So thanks for highlighting that as well. And
Yeah, and just maybe a quick example from my end. The math doesn't sort of add up. At the top of zone 2, I'm burning, I think around 140, 160 grams of carbs per hour, even though it's considered like your, fat adapted, and you still burn quite a bit of fat. And if I go into zone 1 or low zone 2, I'm still burning like 100 grams of carbs per hour. So if I go for like an hour or 2 hour kind of easy run, I will still burn at the low end of zone 2, 200 grams of carbs. And for my weight, that's close to like 3 grams per kilo. And kind of when we think of, let's say, there's another saying, like if you're eating very healthy and clean as an endurance athlete, you're probably underfueling. So if we like focus on, salads and fiber and everything, then we're at most eating like maybe 4 grams of carbs per hour. And there are certain guidelines, like if you have a hard training day or a hard training period, you actually need to be somewhere between maybe like 5 or 7 grams per hour. It doesn't have to come through maybe like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but it means we need to fuel our key sessions. And kind of when you start doing that, when you start, preparing yourself for the runs and actually executing them, that's when you can feel like, okay, my power is coming back. I can hold it longer, and it's a good feeling. And what I feel and what I notice is that some of the athletes are really frustrated that their energy is fluctuating. They're not progressing as they should, even though they're putting a lot of training volume. A lot of it not because they're not training hard, but because they're not kind of managing their kind of the things outside the training, so the recovery, the nutrition, and things like that. And in my coaching, that's what I do the most. It's not necessarily to prescribe the training, but help person to understand kind of how does it fits into a bigger picture and how to fit it into their life, and how to fuel and how to think about it kind of in a more strategic perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, and I think that when we're talking about that, and this is my last question because we are kind of getting to the end of the conversation here, we're a bit over time already, but uh, we are talking about heart rate here a lot, and I think that to a lot of people, it can be hard to understand how to use it, how to know what it is. And to a lot of people, they might get a Garmin watch and it has like default zones on it. And that's what you're looking at. And it's like, oh, yeah, but it was zone 1 today or it was zone 2. And you haven't really had a test yet. You don't really know. And for you and me, we've been athletes before. We've been to labs. We've been able to test this. We know how to do that. But a lot of people don't have the resources or access to, or they don't feel like heading over to a lab to have a test like that made. So what is like very quickly, what is the easiest way for people to get their maximum heart rate and get their zones without like having a lactate monitor or a lab?
I actually don't really believe that much in the maximum heart rate because it has been so kind of so overrated and overtalked. And there is actually also your maximum heart rate that you get like in a race, and then your theoretical maximum, which you can get in the lab, which can be affected. Like even if you go to a lab, but you may be kind of under recovered or haven't slept well, you will not hit your maximum heart rate there, most probably. So what I like to do is, first of all, review some of the mm, races that the person has done and some of the easy runs that the person has done. Then know their resting heart rate. And then in the calculator, which I also have on my website, I play around with the maximum heart rate so that their kind of threshold or the effort that they hold for like 30, maybe 1 hour, or 30, 45 minutes, so that it fits. It's kind of in the, let's say, upper zone 4 in terms of zones. And then once you align it, then you can start looking at the zone 2 heart rate, and then see if that fits the heart rate that a person does kind of most of his runs fits there. And if it doesn't fit, I would go deeper and look into a specific easy session and see if there's a cardiac drift. Because ideally, if you're doing a zone 2, you can exercise the entire day in that zone 2. So if you would run an Ironman, typically you run it somewhere in the middle to upper zone 2, and that's like 3-4 hours of running at the end of an intense day already. And if I see person's cardiac drift, like he says, okay, I ran like my average is 145, that's my zone 2, but I see he starts at like 135, but then it goes into 150, 155, and it's kind of a straight line. I can see that. And in Training Peaks, you can actually highlight and see what's the actual ratio. So that ratio of pace to heart rate or power to heart rate in the first half and the second half should be no higher than 5%. So if all of that fits, then you have your training zones set up. And then from there on, when you do your zone 2 training, just stick to kind of the middle of zone 2, middle or lower end of zone 2. And then there is, because also for the people, for example, I start with coaching, I think it's a little bit, quite a bit actually irresponsible to put them through a maximum heart rate test, because even the best field test that you would do would only get you kind of so far. So, and your maximum heart rate will change. So my maximum heart rate is kind of around 195, 197. It came down a bit throughout the years. But even when I go for a performance test now, at most I can get it to maybe 192.
Yeah,
And that
exactly.
is like literally if I'm in the red and I cannot take a full minute later on.
Yeah.
So, and even if I hit 195, there is a chance that it will be a little bit higher. So,
Mhm.
and if I think of it as a kind of maximum heart rate as a concept, because also in our training we never hit maximum heart rate, we never need it really. We just needed to know what are our zones like 1, 2, 3, 4
Mhm.
really.
Yeah.
Because zone 5 training you don't do by heart rate. Zone 4
Yeah.
training with threshold, you keep it under control, but also you typically do it by power or by pace. And it's zones 1 to 3 that are important to set so that you don't overdo it on your easy days.
Yeah. And for those interested, I will link your calculator and your website down below here. I also want to emphasize that the best way to have your zones calculated is obviously to go to a lab, have a lactate test, like do things so you know better and have more of an understanding. Like I did a test on my fiance, and her zones are so like the range is so small. Like it's crazy. I can't believe how small those ranges were for some 1, 2, 3. Like there were almost like nearly no difference between them, but there is still a big difference in terms of where she's at. And she's been telling me that it's crazy how she can really feel when she enters like zone 3 to 4, but it's
Yeah.
still like everything was within like 15 beats or something. It's crazy. And I was doing some research on this as well in terms of women compared to men. Like women tend to have smaller ranges for their zones sometimes than men do. So that is also nice for people to know that the things, again, back to what you were saying, these are like the golden rules. We are talking about the average athlete in a lot of ways, and there are differences also in terms of what works for different athletes. Last thing that we just need to touch quickly on, Andres, before we end the conversation, and that is your book, The Resilient Athlete. You have the poster behind you for those of you guys who are watching this. I think that people can obviously read more about it. I'm sure there's more information about it on your website, but like quickly, what is the Resilient Athlete about?
So the resilient athlete is about how do you continue to grow in your own way throughout life, regardless how old you are. So the book is split into 3 parts. You have the first and the biggest part is the mindset. Second part is lifestyle and its optimization, and then the third part is training. So a lot of people ask me, "Oh, like I'm not an athlete. Should I still read the book?" And my answer is yes, because training is the easiest part. It's having the right mindset, having the right perspective, the right goals, and actually, the emotional strength and ability to control yourself to really focus on what you need to do. Because let's face it, many of us know what we need to do, but we don't do it. And then the second part is about how do you optimize the lifestyle. So a lot of what we have talked talked right now. How do you set up your lifestyle, even if you're super busy, to take the most out of your training? And then once you have that settled, then you arrive at the training, and then there's a lot about heart rate training, how to organize your season, and all of that. Basically, I wrote it as a book I wish I had when I was 15 to 16. Basically, everything
Love
that I
that.
learned from mindset strategies to training strategies throughout these how many 15 or more years. I put it there so that
Perfect.
so
And
that
where can we find this book?
you can get it on Amazon or Penguin Random House. So I think if you just Google the Resilient Athlete or find it on my website, it's there.
Great. Andrejs, thank you so much for everything that you shared. I feel like we ended up with a bit of a different conversation than I thought. I thought we would talk even more about like the things that you've done, but I really appreciate that we got to dive so deep into the heart rate and the science behind that, because I think a lot of people can benefit from it and people are curious about it. So thank you. Good luck with your training for Boston, and I'll see you there.
I'll see you there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Thank you for taking the time to tune in to the Marathon Podcast. I really appreciate that. I hope you learned a lot about heart rate here. You might be the kind of athlete who's like, I'm going to go by feel, and that's totally fair, totally fine. But just hoping that you still learn something about heart rate and intensity control. Thanks again for listening. Can't wait to have you back again in the next episode on Friday. You listen to the Marathon Podcast, brought to you by Wild Studio.